the Grandview Resort. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the stainless steel surfaces. She had been working at this luxury mountain resort for 3 years now, and most people saw her as just another cook. A quiet woman in her early 30s who kept to herself, prepared excellent meals, and never caused any trouble. What they didn't know was that Maria had spent 8 years as a Force Reconnaissance Marine, completing some of the most dangerous missions in hostile territories around the world. She had chosen this peaceful life deliberately, seeking the calm that came with creating meals instead of the chaos she had left behind. The kitchen was her sanctuary, a place where the only battles were against time and the pursuit of perfect flavors. The resort sat nestled in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by a single winding road. It catered to wealthy guests who came for the isolation, the luxury, and the promise of safety that the remote location provided. The staff quarters were located in a separate building behind the main lodge, connected by covered walkways that meandered through carefully maintained gardens. Maria's daily routine was simple and comforting. She arrived at the kitchen before dawn, prepared breakfast for the early rising guests, planned the day's menus, supervised the prep work for lunch and dinner, and managed the small kitchen staff. Her colleagues knew her as reliable and skilled, but they had no idea about her military background. She preferred it that way. The head chef, Robert Guillaume, was a temperamental Frenchman who appreciated Maria's steady presence and exceptional knife skills. He often wondered aloud how someone so young had developed such precision and discipline in the kitchen, but Maria always deflected these questions with a smile and a shrug. She told people she had learned to cook from her grandmother, which wasn't entirely false, though it left out the years of combat training that had honed her reflexes and tactical thinking. On this particular Tuesday morning in late October, the resort was hosting a group of high-profile guests. Tech executives, politicians, and celebrities had gathered for what was billed as a private conference on digital security and privacy. The guest list was confidential, but Maria had caught glimpses of faces she recognized from news broadcasts and magazine covers. The increased security presence around the resort hadn't gone unnoticed by the staff, though they had been instructed to treat it as routine. As Maria began preparing the mise en place for the day's meals, she noticed several things that struck her as unusual. The normal delivery trucks hadn't arrived on schedule. The maintenance staff seemed nervous and kept checking their phones. Most tellingly, the security guards who usually patrol the grounds in pairs were now moving in groups of 3 or 4, and they seemed more alert than usual. Her military instincts, dormant but never truly gone, began to stir. She found herself automatically cataloging exit routes, noting potential weapons within reach, and observing the patterns of movement throughout the kitchen and dining areas. It was behavior that had kept her alive in Afghanistan and Iraq, and old habits died hard. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came around 10 in the morning. Maria was in the walk-in cooler selecting vegetables for lunch when she heard raised voices from the main dining room. Through the service window, she could see guests gathering near the windows, pointing toward the access road. Someone was shouting about vehicles approaching, and the tone suggested these weren't expected arrivals. Robert burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with excitement and concern. "Maria, we need to secure all the food service immediately. Management wants us to close down the kitchen and move all staff to the back building until further notice." His accent was thicker than usual, a sign that stress was affecting him. "What's happening?" Maria asked, though she was already moving to turn off burners and secure any potentially dangerous equipment. Her training kicked in automatically as she assessed the situation. "They're saying there are unauthorized vehicles on the property. Could be nothing, could be, I don't know, protesters maybe? These guests, they have enemies, you understand." Robert was gathering important papers from his office while speaking. "The security chief wants all non-essential personnel away from the main building." Maria nodded and began helping to secure the kitchen, but her mind was racing. The resort's isolation, which made it attractive to privacy-seeking guests, also made it vulnerable. The single-access road could be easily controlled, cutting off both escape routes and potential rescue. If someone wanted to take control of the property and its high-value guests, this would be an ideal location for such an operation. As they moved through the shutdown procedures, Maria discreetly palmed a 10-inch chef's knife, sliding it into the back of her belt beneath her chef's coat. The weight of it was familiar and reassuring. She also grabbed a smaller paring knife, which she tucked into her boot. These weren't aggressive moves, just precautions based on years of training that had taught her to always be prepared. The kitchen staff, 2 sous chefs, 3 line cooks, and a dishwasher were all gathered near the back exit when the first sounds of gunfire echoed across the mountain air. Everyone froze. The sharp cracks were unmistakable, and they were coming from the direction of the main entrance. Through the kitchen windows, Maria could see black SUVs positioned around the main building. Men in dark clothing were moving with military precision, establishing a perimeter and controlling access points. This wasn't a random attack or a protest that had gotten out of hand. This was a coordinated assault by professionals. "Everyone stay calm," she said quietly, taking charge as Robert seemed to be going into shock. "We need to move to the back building quickly and quietly. No running, no shouting. Just walk normally." As they made their way along the covered walkway, Maria stayed at the rear of the group, constantly scanning their surroundings. She counted at least 12 attackers that she could see, all armed with military-style weapons, and moving with the coordination of a well-trained unit. Their positioning suggested they had studied the property layout carefully and had planned this operation in detail. The staff quarters building was supposed to be their safe haven, but as they approached, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth led around to the back of the building, where there should have been no vehicle traffic. Someone had already been here. "Stop," she said quietly, causing the group to halt. "Robert, take everyone back toward the garden shed. Wait there and don't move until I come for you." "Maria, what are you doing?" Robert's voice cracked with fear. "Just trust me. Something's not right about the staff building." She didn't want to alarm them further, but her instincts were screaming that they were walking into a trap. As the kitchen staff reluctantly moved toward the tool shed that was hidden among the trees, Maria circled around to approach the staff quarters from a different angle. Moving with the silent footsteps that had been drilled into her during reconnaissance training, she worked her way to a window where she could observe the interior. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. 3 armed men were positioned inside the building, clearly waiting for the staff to arrive. They had radios and were in communication with the main assault team. This wasn't just about taking control of the resort and its guests. They intended to eliminate any potential witnesses or complications, including the kitchen staff. Maria felt the familiar calm that came with accepting a dangerous situation. The peaceful life she had built was about to be shattered, but that didn't mean she had to be a victim. She had skills that these attackers didn't know about, advantages they couldn't plan for. They expected to find a frightened cook, but they were about to encounter a forced Recon Marine. Moving back to where the kitchen staff was hiding, she found them huddled together in the garden shed, their faces pale with fear. The sound of gunfire had increased, and there were explosions coming from the direction of the main building. Whatever was happening there, it was escalating rapidly. "Listen to me carefully," Maria said in a calm, steady voice that cut through their panic. "The staff building is compromised. There are armed men waiting inside for us. We can't go there, and we can't stay here." "What do you mean, armed men?" one of the sous chefs asked. "Who are you? How do you know this?" Maria looked at each of them in turn. These people had worked beside her for years. Trusting her with their safety now required her to trust them with her secret. "I used to be a soldier. Malinko. I know how to handle situations like this, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly." The revelation stunned them into silence for a moment. Robert was the first to speak. "You were military? But you're just a cook." "I'm a cook now," Maria replied. But before that, I was trained for combat. Right now, that training might be the only thing that keeps us alive." She began outlining a plan. The forest surrounding the resort was dense enough to provide cover, and she knew from her daily runs that there were hiking trails that led down the mountain to a ranger station about 5 miles away. If they could reach the tree without being detected, they had a chance of escaping and getting help. "What about the guests in the main building?" asked Jenny, one of the line cooks. "Shouldn't we try to help them?" Maria's expression hardened. "Our priority is staying alive. Those guests have security details and safe rooms. We have nothing but what we can carry." She paused, considering. "Once we reach safety and get help, then we can worry about rescue operations." As they prepared to move, Maria distributed improvised weapons from the garden shed. Shovels, pruning shears, and anything else that could be used for defense if necessary. She also grabbed a coil of rope and some basic first aid supplies. Her military mind was already planning multiple contingencies and escape routes. The group began moving through the gardens, staying low and using the landscaping for cover. Maria took point. Using hand signals, she quickly taught them to communicate when words might be overheard. Every few minutes, she would stop and listen, filtering the natural sounds of the forest from anything that might indicate pursuit. They had covered about half the distance to the tree line when Maria heard something that made her signal for an immediate halt. Footsteps moving through the underbrush ahead of them. Not random movement, but the deliberate patrol pattern of someone searching the grounds. Motioning for the others to stay hidden behind a large ornamental boulder, Maria moved forward to assess the threat. What she saw made her realize that their situation was even worse than she had feared. The attackers weren't just controlling the buildings. They had teams sweeping the entire property to ensure no one escaped. A three-man patrol was moving methodically through their area, clearly following a predetermined search pattern. They were dressed in black tactical gear and carried assault rifles with practiced familiarity. These weren't random criminals or desperate amateurs. They were professionals, possibly military or former military themselves. Maria watched their movement for several minutes, noting their spacing, communication methods, and patrol timing. She counted radios, observed their weapon handling, and assessed their level of alertness. They were good, but they were also overconfident. They expected to find hiding civilians, not someone who could fight back effectively. Making her decision, Maria returned to the group and explained the situation in whispered tones. "There's a patrol between us and the forest. 3 men, well-armed and trained. I can handle them, but I need you to continue toward the tree line once I create a distraction." "Handle them how?" Robert asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand that Maria was far more than she had appeared to be. "Quietly, permanently." The coldness in her voice left no doubt about her intentions. "This isn't about capturing prisoners or avoiding violence anymore. These people are here to kill everyone on this property, including us. I won't let that happen." She gave them detailed instructions on how to reach the forest, which trail to follow, and where to wait if they became separated. The ranger station would have radio communication with outside authorities, and it was their best hope for organizing a proper response to what was happening at the resort. "What about you?" Jenny asked. "How will you find us?" "I'll catch up," Maria replied. "But if I don't make it to the ranger station by sunset, don't wait for me. Get help and get off this mountain." Before anyone could protest, Maria disappeared into the undergrowth with a silence that seemed impossible for someone moving through dense vegetation. Her military training had included extensive work in stealth and reconnaissance, skills that proved their value now as she began to stalk the patrol that stood between her people and safety. The first man never knew what hit him. Maria approached from behind while he was examining some tracks near a garden path, sliding the chef's knife between his ribs with surgical precision. He dropped without a sound, his weapon secured before his body finished falling. The second patrol member was investigating a noise near the ornamental pond when Maria struck again. This time she used a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious in seconds, followed by a quick twist that ensured he would never wake up. 2 down, 1 to go. The third man was the most alert and experienced of the group. When his partners failed to respond to radio checks, he immediately became suspicious and began moving in a defensive pattern that showed real training. Maria realized she was dealing with someone who knew how to fight. Their encounter was brief, but intense. The man spotted Maria's approach and managed to bring his rifle up, but she was already inside his firing arc. What followed was a deadly dance of combat techniques, military training against military training, with the winner being determined by split-second reflexes and years of experience. When it was over, Maria stood among 3 bodies, slightly winded but uninjured. She quickly searched them for useful equipment, taking extra ammunition, a radio, and a detailed map of the resort that showed patrol routes and timing. The map confirmed her worst fears about the scope of this operation. The attackers had divided the property into sectors and were systematically searching every building, every trail, and every possible hiding place. They had communication with air support, indicating helicopters on standby. Most ominously, the map showed that they had planned for a complete lockdown of the area that would last for several days. This wasn't a quick hit-and-run operation. These people intended to hold the resort and its guests for an extended period, which meant they had political or financial demands that required time to negotiate. It also meant that any staff or witnesses who couldn't be controlled would be eliminated to prevent complications. Maria pocketed the radio and the map, then began moving toward the tree where she hoped to find the kitchen staff. As she moved, she could hear increased radio chatter indicating that the missing patrol had been noticed. Soon there would be additional teams searching for whoever had eliminated them. The forest edge seemed impossibly far away as she made her way through the gardens, but Maria's training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. She moved from cover to cover, timing her advances to coincide with distractions caused by activity around the main building, and constantly monitored the radio for intelligence about enemy movements. When she finally reached the predetermined rendezvous point at the edge of the forest, she found the kitchen staff huddled together behind a fallen log, their faces showing the strain of the past hour. Robert looked up as she approached, relief flooding his features when he recognized her silhouette. "Thank God," he whispered. "We heard gunshots and thought." "The patrol is handled," Maria replied quietly. "But they'll send more teams when those 3 don't report in. We need to be deep in the forest before that happens." As they began moving along the hiking trail that would lead them down the mountain, Maria couldn't help but think about the guests and remaining staff still trapped in the resort. Her military training told her that the smart move was to escape and call for help, but her conscience struggled with abandoning people who might be depending on help that would never come. The radio she had taken crackled with updates about the situation in the main building. For what she could gather, the attackers had secured their primary targets and were now consolidating their control over the property. There were references to packages and delivery schedules that suggested this was indeed a kidnapping operation with political or financial motivations. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She was done running. These attackers had made the mistake of threatening people under her protection, and they had chosen to operate in an environment where her military skills gave her significant advantages. By the time the kitchen staff reached the ranger station and called for help, Maria Santos, the quiet cook, would be gone. In her place would be the Force Recon Marine who had never failed a mission and who was about to remind a group of overconfident terrorists why you should never underestimate the person preparing your food. The real battle was about to begin. Maria watched from the tree as the kitchen staff disappeared down the mountain trail toward the ranger station. Robert had protested when she told them she wasn't coming with them, but her mind was made up. She had spent 3 years trying to forget the warrior she used to be, but sometimes the past demands to be remembered. The radio chatter from the device she had taken off the dead patrol member was becoming more urgent. The attackers had discovered the missing team and were expanding their search patterns. More concerning was the information she was gathering about their operation. This wasn't a simple hostage situation. From the coded language being used, it appeared they were planning to hold the resort guests for several days while conducting some kind of auction or negotiation. Maria understood now why the guest list had been so secretential. These weren't just wealthy people on vacation. They were targets specifically chosen for their value to government agencies, rival corporations, or foreign powers. The attackers weren't planning to simply demand ransom money. They were planning to sell access, information, or leverage to the highest bidder. Moving silently through the forest that bordered the resort property, Maria began conducting the kind of reconnaissance that had been her specialty in the Marines. She needed to understand the full scope of the operation before she could plan any kind of response. Her training had taught her that knowledge was more valuable than firepower, and patience was more deadly than aggression. The resort covered nearly 200 acres, with the main lodge at the center surrounded by guest cabins, service buildings, and extensive gardens. The attackers had positioned themselves to control all the obvious access points, but Maria knew from her daily runs that there were service roads, utility access points, and maintenance areas that might not be on their maps. As darkness began to fall, Maria used the cover it provided to move closer to the main building. What she observed confirmed her worst fears about the professionalism of this operation. The attackers had established a proper perimeter with overlapping fields of fire, communication protocols, and shift schedules that indicated they were prepared for an extended siege. Through the windows of the main lodge, she could see groups of guests being held in the conference rooms under armed guard. The attackers were keeping them separated, probably to prevent any coordinated resistance efforts. Several of the security personnel who had been protecting the guests were lying motionless in the main lobby, and Maria felt a surge of anger at the sight. But what caught her attention most was the equipment being unloaded from vehicles that had arrived after the initial assault. Sophisticated communication gear, computer equipment, and what appeared to be interrogation tools. These people weren't just planning to hold their prisoners. They were planning to extract information from them. The radio crackled with an update that chilled her blood. "Control, this is Team 3. Still no contact with perimeter patrol. We're showing 15 packages secured in conference rooms A and B. Team leaders are requesting permission to begin Phase 2 interviews." Phase 2 interviews. Maria's military experience with intelligence operations told her exactly what that meant. They were planning to torture the guests to extract whatever information, codes, or leverage they needed for their operation. This changed everything about the timeline and the urgency of any response. Working her way around the perimeter, Maria began to map out the attackers' positions and patrol patterns. She counted at least 20 operatives visible on the grounds, with others inside the building. All were well-armed and equipped with military-grade gear. Radio discipline was good, and they rotated positions regularly to prevent predictability. However, her trained eye also spotted weaknesses. The attackers were focused on external threats and escape attempts. They weren't expecting an attack from someone already inside their perimeter. Their confidence in their initial sweep meant they weren't maintaining the kind of paranoid vigilance that would detect a single operative moving with stealth training. As she completed her reconnaissance, Maria heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching. For a moment, hope flared that rescue might be arriving, but the radio chatter quickly disabused her of that notion. These were additional resources for the attackers, not rescue forces. 2 helicopters landed in the main parking area, disgorging more personnel and equipment. Maria watched as a man in expensive clothing stepped out of one aircraft and was greeted by what appeared to be the operation commander. Even from a distance, she could see this wasn't military personnel. This was someone accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. The radio provided more details as the new arrivals coordinated with the ground teams. Phase 2 is authorized. Begin with packages 7 through 12. Full spectrum interrogation protocols approved. Timeline is 48 hours for complete extraction. Maria felt the familiar cold anger that had made her such an effective force recon Marine. These weren't soldiers fighting for their country or even criminals desperate for money. These were professional torturers who had turned human suffering into a business model that made them enemies in the most personal sense of the word. But anger without planning was useless, and Maria had learned long ago to channel her emotions into tactical thinking. She needed to shift from reconnaissance to active operations, but doing so effectively required resources she didn't currently possess. More importantly, it required a plan that could succeed against overwhelming odds. The resort's kitchen would be her command center. It was a location she knew better than anyone else on the property. It contained tools and materials she could use as weapons, and, most importantly, it was probably being ignored by the attackers now that they believed all staff had been eliminated or evacuated. Moving through the gardens using techniques she hadn't employed since Afghanistan, Maria made her way back to the kitchen building. The main lodge was brightly lit and heavily guarded, but the service areas were dark and seemingly abandoned. Her familiarity with every path, every door, and every window gave her advantages that years of special operations training had taught her to exploit. The kitchen was exactly as she had left it earlier in the day, though it felt like a lifetime ago. Equipment shut down, surfaces cleaned, everything in its proper place. But now she was seeing it through different eyes, not as a cook's workspace, but as an armory full of potential weapons and a fortress that could be defended if necessary. Industrial kitchens contained an amazing array of items that could be turned into weapons with the right knowledge. Commercial-grade knives that held edges better than most military blades. Cleaning chemicals that could be combined into explosives or incapacitants. Gas lines that could be weaponized. Heavy equipment that could provide cover or be used to create obstacles. Maria began gathering materials and planning her campaign. The attackers had made several critical mistakes based on their assumptions about the resort and its staff. They had underestimated the defensible qualities of the kitchen complex. They had failed to post permanent guards on the service areas. Most importantly, they had no idea that one of the people they thought they had cleared from the property was capable of conducting the kind of asymmetric warfare that could turn their organized operation into chaos. As she worked, Maria monitored the radio traffic to track the attackers' activities and patrol schedules. The Phase 2 interviews had begun, and the sounds of screaming from the main lodge confirmed her worst fears about what was happening to the guests. Time was running out for those people, and help from outside authorities was still hours away at best. Moving through the kitchen complex, Maria began setting up what Special Forces operatives called a harassment campaign. The goal wasn't to directly assault the attackers' main force, but to create confusion, fear, and doubt that would degrade their effectiveness and force them to divide their attention. The resort's sprinkler system became her first tool. By accessing the main controls in the basement mechanical room, she could trigger fire alarms and water damage that would force the attackers to respond to false emergencies. More importantly, the chaos would mask her movements and create opportunities for more direct action. The kitchen's gas lines provided another option. While she couldn't create the kind of massive explosion seen in movies without risking the lives of the hostages, she could create controlled releases that would force evacuations of specific areas and disrupt the attackers' carefully planned positions. But her most effective weapon would be psychological. The attackers believed they were in complete control of a contained situation. When members of their team started disappearing or being found dead in impossible locations, their confidence would begin to crack. Fear and paranoia would make them less effective and more likely to make mistakes. As midnight approached, Maria was ready to begin her one-woman war against the people who had turned her peaceful sanctuary into a torture chamber. She had weapons ranging from improvised explosives to professional quality blades. She had escape routes and fallback positions mapped throughout the complex. Most importantly, she had the kind of focused anger that had made her one of the Marine Corps' most effective special operations warriors. The radio crackled with routine status updates as the attackers maintained their perimeter and continued their interviews of the hostages. They were confident in their success and complacent about their security. That was about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. Maria checked her equipment one final time, then opened a window that would allow her to move from the kitchen to the main lodge without being detected by the perimeter guards. Somewhere in that building were innocent people being tortured by professionals who thought they were untouchable. They were about to learn why Force Reconnaissance Marines were considered the most dangerous soldiers in the world, and why underestimating a quiet cook had been the last mistake some of them would ever make. The hunter had become the hunted, but they didn't know it yet. As she slipped out into the darkness, Maria Santos ceased to exist. In her place was Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Marine Corps, on a mission to protect civilians from enemy combatants. The rules of engagement were clear, the objectives were defined, and failure was not an option. The kitchen had been her sanctuary, but now it would become her command post in a battle that would determine whether evil would triumph or whether one determined Marine could remind the world that some lines should never be crossed. The war for the Grandview Resort was about to begin. The first casualty never saw it coming. Maria had been tracking the lone sentry who walked a patrol route between the main lodge and the guest cabins for nearly an hour, memorizing his timing, his habits, and the moments when he was most vulnerable. When he stopped to light a cigarette near the ornamental fountain, she struck with the silent efficiency that had made her legendary among her Marine Corps unit. The combat knife slid between his ribs with surgical precision, angled upward to pierce the heart. He collapsed without a sound, his weapon secured before his body finished falling. Maria dragged him into the shadows behind the fountain and took his radio, ammunition, and identification. She now had access to their communication network and a second weapon. From the radio chatter, she learned that the attackers were operating under the call signs of a professional military contractor. Their leader went by Control, and they had divided the resort into numbered sectors with specific teams responsible for each area. The information confirmed her assessment that these weren't random criminals, but professional soldiers working for someone with significant resources. The screaming from the main lodge had stopped temporarily, which either meant the torturer had taken a break or one of the hostages had given them what they wanted. Either way, it reminded Maria that time was running out for the people depending on her to create enough chaos to disrupt this operation. Moving through the gardens with the ghost-like silence she had perfected in Iraq and Afghanistan, Maria began hunting her second target. The attackers had positioned a two-man team on the roof of the main lodge to provide overwatch for the entire property. Getting to them required climbing skills and timing that would challenge even her advanced training, but eliminating that overwatch position would blind the attackers to movement across significant portions of the grounds. The service ladder that maintenance crews used to access the roof was located on the back side of the building, hidden from most sight lines by carefully planned landscaping. Maria had used this ladder numerous times during her employment to help with routine repairs, never imagining she would one day use it for a combat infiltration. The climb took her past several windows where she could see glimpses of the hostage situation inside. The guests were being held in two main conference rooms under heavy guard, just as the radio traffic had indicated. But what caught her attention was the sophisticated electronic equipment that had been set up in what used to be the resort's business center. Through the windows, she could see computer specialists working with devices she didn't recognize, but their purpose was clear from the context. These people weren't just extracting information through torture. They were conducting electronic surveillance, probably hacking into the digital devices and accounts of their hostages to steal financial information, business secrets, or government intelligence. This was a comprehensive intelligence operation disguised as a kidnapping, which meant the stakes were higher than she had initially realized. The hostages weren't just wealthy individuals being held for ransom. They were sources of information that could affect national security, corporate competition, or political stability. Reaching the roof, Maria found the two-man Overwatch team exactly where she expected them to be. They had positioned themselves with excellent fields of fire covering the entire property, but they were focused on external threats and escape attempts. Neither of them was watching the access ladder they had assumed was secured. The first sniper was scanning the tree through a night vision scope when Maria's knife found his throat. She held him as he died, preventing any sound that might alert his partner, then carefully positioned his body to look like he was still scanning his assigned sector. The second sniper presented a more complex challenge. He was positioned where he could see his partner's location, and any unusual movement would trigger an immediate alert. Maria studied his position and patrol pattern, waiting for the moment when his attention would be focused entirely away from his partner's position. When that moment came, she moved with the fluid speed that years of special operations training had burned in her muscle memory. The sniper had a brief instant to realize something was wrong before Maria's knife ended his ability to raise any alarm. She arranged both bodies to look like they were still actively patrolling their sectors, buying precious time before their absence would be discovered. From the roof position, Maria had an excellent view of the entire operation. She could see patrol routes, guard positions, and the location of various equipment and vehicles. Most importantly, she could observe the main entrance where additional personnel and supplies were occasionally arriving. The radio crackled with routine status updates that gave her insight into the attacker's timeline and objectives. Control, this is Team 2. Package extraction proceeding on schedule. Estimate 6 hours for complete data harvest from primary targets. 6 hours. That was how long she had to disrupt this operation before irreversible damage was done to the hostages and potentially to national security. It also told her that help from outside authorities would arrive too late to prevent whatever information theft was being conducted. Maria began the next phase of her campaign by accessing the roof-mounted communication equipment the attackers had installed. Using techniques she had learned in electronic warfare training, she began introducing subtle interference into their radio network. Not enough to completely disrupt communications, but sufficient to create doubt and force them to repeat transmissions or send personnel to check on each other more frequently. The psychological impact was immediate and exactly what she had hoped for. Voices on the radio became more tense. Check-in schedules became more frequent, and patrol patterns became less predictable as individual teams began to worry about communication problems. But Maria's real target was the main communication hub that the attackers had established in the resort's original satellite communication room. Destroying or disrupting that equipment would cut them off from their outside support and prevent them from transmitting any stolen information to their employers. Getting to the communication room required crossing the main lobby area where hostages were being held under heavy guard. This meant Maria would need to create a distraction significant enough to draw guards away from their posts without endangering the civilians she was trying to protect. The resort's fire suppression system provided the perfect opportunity. By triggering specific sensors in predetermined sequences, she could create the appearance of multiple fires throughout the property without actually endangering anyone. The attackers would be forced to respond to protect their valuable hostages and expensive equipment. Maria climbed down from the roof and made her way to the mechanical room in the basement where the building's main systems were controlled. Her 3 years of employment at the resort had given her intimate knowledge of these systems, including override codes and manual controls that weren't documented in any plans the attackers might have obtained. The fire suppression activation was carefully choreographed to create maximum confusion with minimum actual danger. Alarms began sounding throughout the building, emergency lighting activated, and sprinkler systems triggered in areas where they would disrupt the attackers' equipment without harming hostages. The response was immediate and exactly what Maria had predicted. Guards were pulled from their posts to investigate the alarms, protect sensitive equipment, and maintain control over panicked hostages. The careful organization of the operation began to fray as personnel were forced to respond to multiple apparent emergencies simultaneously. Using the chaos as cover, Maria made her way through service corridors to the communication room. The guard who had been posted there had been called away to help with the fire emergency, leaving the sophisticated electronic equipment temporarily unprotected. Maria's knowledge of communication systems from her military service told her exactly which components to disable for maximum effect. Rather than destroying everything in an obvious sabotage attempt, she made selective modifications that would cause gradual system failures and phantom malfunctions. The equipment would appear to be working normally until critical moments when it would fail unexpectedly. As she worked, the radio chatter revealed the psychological impact of her harassment campaign. Control, this is Team 4. We're showing multiple system failures and communication anomalies. Request permission to begin systematic security sweep. Negative, Team 4. Priority remains package processing. Fire suppression is automatic system malfunction. Maintain positions and continue operations. But Maria could hear the strain in the voices, the doubt creeping into their professional confidence. They were beginning to suspect that their operation wasn't proceeding as smoothly as planned, even though they couldn't identify specific threats. Her next target was the motor pool where the attackers had parked their vehicles. Disabling their transportation would prevent rapid reinforcement or extraction while also eliminating their ability to move hostages quickly if their operation was compromised. The vehicle bay was located in a separate building that housed the resort's maintenance equipment. Maria's familiarity with this area gave her multiple approach routes and hiding places, but it also meant she was moving into an area where her absence might be noticed by resort staff who had worked with these vehicles. The attackers had posted a single guard at the motor pool, probably considering it a low-priority target since they controlled all access roads to the property. That overconfidence cost the guard his life when Maria struck from behind as he was checking his phone instead of maintaining proper surveillance. Working quickly, Maria disabled the vehicles using techniques that would prevent them from starting without causing immediately obvious damage. Severed ignition wires, punctured fuel lines, and disabled starters would leave the vehicles looking normal until someone tried to use them under emergency conditions. But her most important modification was to the communication equipment in the attacker's command vehicle. By installing a small device she constructed from components found in the resort's electronics workshop, she could now monitor their supposedly secure communications and potentially disrupt them at critical moments. As she finished her work in the motor pool, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold. Screaming had resumed from the main lodge, but this time it was different. More intense, more desperate. The attackers were escalating their interrogation techniques, probably frustrated by the various system failures and delays that her sabotage had created. Time was running out faster than she had hoped. The psychological pressure she was applying to the attackers was working, but it was also making them more brutal with their hostages as they tried to maintain their operational timeline despite the mysterious problems plaguing their mission. Maria checked her equipment and prepared for the most dangerous phase of her one-woman war. She had weakened the attackers' organization, disrupted their communications, and eliminated several of their personnel. But to truly stop this operation, she would need to move from harassment tactics to direct assault. The main lodge contained at least 15 armed operatives, sophisticated security systems, and innocent civilians who could be killed if her attack triggered a hostage execution protocol. Any mistake would result in the deaths of the people she was trying to save. But as another scream echoed across the mountain air, Maria Santos made the same decision she had made countless times in combat zones around the world. Some fights were worth the risk, and some enemies deserved to face the full fury of a United States Marine who had been pushed too far. The kitchen where she had found peace for 3 years would now become the staging area for the most important battle of her military career. Everything she had learned about warfare, everything she had sacrificed for her country, and everything she had gained from her quiet civilian life was about to be tested in a confrontation that would determine whether evil would triumph or whether one determined warrior could remind the world why Americans fight. The time for subtlety was over. The time for direct action had arrived. Maria stood in the center of the industrial kitchen that had been her sanctuary for 3 years, but now she saw it through the eyes of a Force Recon Marine planning the most important assault of her career. Every piece of equipment, Every angle of approach, every potential cover position was cataloged and evaluated. This kitchen was about to become the epicenter of a battle that would determine the fate of 15 innocent hostages and the success of a terrorist operation with international implications. The radio chatter she had been monitoring revealed that her harassment campaign was having the desired effect. The attackers were becoming increasingly frustrated with equipment failures, communication problems, and the mysterious disappearance of patrol members. Their professional confidence was cracking, and their operational timeline was falling behind schedule. Control, this is Team Leader Alpha. We're showing 6 personnel non-responsive and multiple system failures. Request permission to initiate lockdown protocol and begin systematic sweep for hostile elements. Negative Alpha. Maintain interrogation schedule. Missing personnel are probably dealing with fire suppression issues. We have less than 4 hours to complete data extraction before extraction window closes. For hours, Maria had bought some time with her sabotage, but not enough. The torture sessions in the main lodge were intensifying as the attackers tried to compensate for their delays, and the screams that echoed across the property were becoming more frequent and more desperate. But now Maria had advantages she hadn't possessed at the beginning of this ordeal. She had detailed knowledge of their communication protocols, their patrol patterns, and their psychological state. Most importantly, she had identified their critical vulnerabilities and the points where a coordinated attack could collapse their entire operation. The kitchen's industrial gas system would be her primary weapon. Unlike the controlled releases she had used earlier for distraction, she was now planning something that would eliminate multiple targets while creating enough chaos to mask a direct assault on the main lodge. The risk to herself was enormous, but the alternative was to let professional torturers complete their mission while she hid in the shadows. Maria began preparing explosive devices using the industrial-grade cleaning chemicals stored in the kitchen's supply areas. Her military training included extensive work with improvised explosives, and the supplies available in a commercial kitchen provided everything needed for devastating anti-personnel devices. The largest device would be positioned in the building's main gas line, timed to detonate when a maximum number of attackers were in the targeted area. Smaller devices would be placed at strategic choke points to channel survivors into predetermined kill zones where Maria could engage them with conventional weapons. As she worked, Maria monitored the radio traffic to track the attackers' movements and identify the optimal timing for her assault. The pattern that emerged showed guard rotations every 2 hours, with the highest concentration of personnel in the main lodge during interrogation sessions that seemed to follow a predetermined schedule. But what really caught her attention was a conversation between the operation commander and what appeared to be a superior authority. Control, this is base command. Timeline is critical. Primary packages must be processed completely before dawn. Secondary packages are expendable if necessary to maintain schedule. Secondary packages. That was how they referred to the hostages they considered less valuable, the ones who would be killed to save time if the operation fell behind schedule. The casual way they discussed murdering innocent people filled Maria with the cold anger that had made her such an effective warrior. Through the kitchen windows, she could see the attackers' positions around the main lodge. They had established overlapping fields of fire and proper communication protocols, but they were also showing signs of the stress and confusion her harassment campaign had created. Guards were checking their equipment repeatedly, patrol timing had become erratic, and radio discipline was breaking down. More importantly, Maria could see that they had positioned their most sophisticated electronic equipment in the resort's main conference room, the same room where they were holding the highest value hostages. This meant that any successful assault would need to eliminate the guards while avoiding damage to equipment and civilians in the same confined space. The solution came from her knowledge of the building's construction and her experience with close-quarters combat in urban environments. The main conference room had a false ceiling that concealed ventilation ducts large enough for human passage. If she could reach those ducts undetected, she would have the element of surprise and the ability to position herself directly above her targets. But first, she needed to eliminate the perimeter guards and create enough chaos to draw attention away from the main building. The explosive devices she had prepared would serve that purpose, while also reducing the number of attackers she would face in the final assault. Maria checked her equipment one last time. Combat knives, improvised explosive devices, the assault rifle she had taken from the first patrol, and the radio that gave her access to their communications. She also carried a small device she had constructed from kitchen equipment that would allow her to trigger the gas line explosion remotely. The attack began at exactly 2 a.m. when the guard rotation schedule showed the minimum number of personnel on external patrol. Maria triggered the first explosive device near the motor pool, creating a massive fireball that lit up the night sky and drew immediate response from the attackers. As personnel rushed to investigate the explosion, Maria detonated the second device at the service entrance to the main building, eliminating 3 guards and sealing one of the primary access routes. The radio chatter immediately became frantic as the attackers realized they were under coordinated assault. Control, we are taking fire from multiple positions. Repeat, we are under attack by unknown hostile force. Request immediate backup from all units. But Maria was already moving to her next position, using the chaos and confusion to eliminate isolated guards who were responding to the explosions. Her Marine Corps training in close-quarters combat proved its value as she systematically reduced the attackers' numbers while avoiding their attempts to locate and engage her. The psychological impact was exactly what she had hoped for. Professional soldiers who had been confident in their control of the situation suddenly found themselves fighting an invisible enemy who struck without warning and disappeared before they could respond. Fear and paranoia began to replace tactical thinking. When Maria triggered the main gas line explosion, the blast shattered windows throughout the resort and created a wall of flame that separated the main lodge from the rest of the property. In the chaos that followed, she began her infiltration of the building through the ventilation system. The ductwork was exactly as she remembered from helping maintenance crews with repairs over the past 3 years. Narrow, dark, and cramped, but providing access to every room in the building. Moving through the ducts with the silence she had learned in countless reconnaissance missions, Maria positioned herself above the main conference room where the hostages were being held. Through the acoustic tiles of the false ceiling, she could see the situation below. 15 hostages zip-tied to chairs, arranged in 2 rows facing a table where sophisticated interrogation equipment had been set up. For guards with automatic weapons maintained perimeter security, while 2 specialists continued their torture sessions despite the explosions outside. The electronic equipment was positioned against the far wall, exactly where Maria had expected it to be based on the building's power distribution system. Computer terminals, communication devices, and data storage equipment worth millions of dollars and containing information that could affect national security. Maria's plan required split-second timing and absolute precision. She would drop through the ceiling tiles directly above the guards, eliminate them before they could harm the hostages, then secure the room while preventing any damage to the electronic equipment that might contain evidence needed to prosecute the organizations behind this operation. The moment came when both interrogators were focused on their current victim, a tech executive whose screams had been echoing through the building for the past hour. Maria removed the ceiling tile directly above the nearest guard and dropped into the room with the silent efficiency of a predator striking its prey. The first guard died before he could raise his weapon. The second managed to turn toward the threat, but Maria's knife found his throat before he could call out a warning. The third guard had time to realize what was happening and reach for his radio, but Maria's assault rifle ended his life before he could transmit an alert. The fourth guard was positioned where he could see the hostages, and Maria knew he might kill civilians if he felt threatened. This required a different approach, one that relied on psychological warfare rather than direct violence. "Don't move," Maria said quietly, her weapon trained on a center mass. Your operation is over. Your perimeter team is dead, your communications are compromised, and law enforcement is on the way. You can live through this if you make smart choices. The guard was young, probably military contractor personnel rather than a hardened terrorist. The sudden appearance of death in what he had thought was a controlled situation broke his training and his confidence. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands, choosing survival over a hopeless fight. The two interrogators presented a different challenge. They were not military personnel, but rather specialists in extracting information through torture. When they saw Maria, they immediately moved toward the hostages as human shields, clearly intending to kill innocent people to protect themselves. This was the moment that defined Maria's entire military career and her civilian life afterward. Everything she had learned about warfare, everything she believed about protecting innocent people, and everything she had sacrificed for peace came together in a split-second decision that would determine whether evil would triumph or whether justice would prevail. The first interrogator never completed his movement toward the hostages. Maria's shot took him center mass, dropping him instantly. The second managed to grab one of the hostages before Maria's second shot ended his life. Both died, knowing that their victims would live while their operation crumbled around them. In the sudden silence that followed, Maria could hear the radio chatter from the surviving attackers as they struggled to understand what had happened to their carefully planned operation. Voices that had been confident hours earlier now carried fear and confusion as they realized their advantage had been stripped away by a single opponent. Control, we've lost contact with the interrogation team. Repeat, no response from main conference room. Request immediate backup and medical support. But there would be no backup and no medical support would save the people Maria had killed. The professional soldiers who had thought they were conducting a routine hostage operation had learned too late that they had underestimated the person they assumed was just a cook. As Maria began cutting the zip ties that held the hostages, she could hear helicopters approaching in the distance. Whether they carried reinforcement for the attackers or rescue forces summoned by the kitchen staff who had escaped hours earlier, she needed to secure the evidence in this room and prepare for whatever came next. The battle for the Grandview Resort wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The quiet cook who had sought peace in mountain solitude had become the warrior who reminded a group of professional terrorists that some people are far more dangerous than they appear, and that underestimating an American Marine is a mistake that can cost everything. The kitchen had been her sanctuary, but it had also been her fortress. Now it was time to finish the war she had never wanted to fight, but would never hesitate to when the sound of helicopters grew louder as Maria finished freeing the last of the hostages from their restraints. Through the shattered windows of the conference room, she could see aircraft circling the resort with searchlights scanning the grounds. The question was whether these were reinforcements for the remaining attackers or rescue forces responding to the emergency calls made hours earlier when her kitchen staff had reached the ranger station. The radio she had taken from the dead guards crackled with increasingly desperate communications from the surviving members of the terrorist operation. Control, this is Team 7. We are taking heavy casualties from unknown hostile force. Estimate single operator with advanced training. Request immediate extraction and abort protocols. Negative, Team 7. Mission parameters have not changed. Secure remaining packages and maintain position until reinforcement arrives. But Maria could hear the fear in the voices now, the professional confidence completely shattered by losses they couldn't explain or counter. These were soldiers who had been trained to fight conventional battles against identifiable enemies, not to face a phantom warrior who struck without warning from the shadows of a place they thought they controlled. As she helped the rescued hostages move to a safer area of the building, Maria learned more about the scope of the operation that had targeted them. The guests included technology executives with access to classified defense contracts, politicians with knowledge of intelligence operations, and business leaders whose information could affect international markets. They weren't just torturing us for ransom, said David Shun. a tech mogul whose company had military contracts worth billions. They were copying our phones, downloading our files, demanding passwords to corporate systems. This was industrial espionage on a massive scale. They had detailed files on all of us, added Senator Patricia Williams, whose Intelligence Committee access made her a target for foreign agents. Personal information, family details, business relationships. Someone sold them information that took months to compile. The implications were staggering. This hadn't been a random kidnapping or even a simple intelligence operation. It was a coordinated attack on American economic and national security interests conducted by people with resources that suggested state sponsorship or organized criminal backing at the highest levels. But Maria's immediate concern was the 7 remaining attackers who were still positioned throughout the resort. The radio chatter indicated they were consolidating their positions and preparing for a final stand, probably hoping their reinforcements would arrive before law enforcement could organize an effective response. Through the windows, she could see the helicopters were military aircraft, but she couldn't determine whether they belonged to the attackers or to rescue forces. The answer came when one of the aircraft began broadcasting on emergency frequencies that she could monitor through the resort's communication system. "This is Colonel Martinez, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Resort personnel and hostages, if you can hear this transmission, remain in secure positions. We have personnel on the ground and are coordinating with local law enforcement for site clearing operations." Relief flooded through Maria as she realized that help had finally arrived. But her Marine training also told her that the most dangerous part of any hostage rescue operation was the final phase, when desperate enemies might choose to kill their prisoners rather than face capture. The remaining attackers had positioned themselves in the resort's guest cabins, which gave them excellent defensive positions but also isolated them from each other. Radio communications revealed they were planning to fight to the death rather than surrender, probably because they knew their own governments would disavow them if they were captured. Maria made a decision that brought her full circle from the cook who had sought peace to the warrior who understood that sometimes violence was the only path to justice. She would not wait for the rescue forces to slowly clear each building while risking the lives of any remaining hostages or innocent personnel. The guest cabins were connected by covered walkways that provided concealment for movement, but also channeled attackers into predictable routes. Maria's knowledge of the resort layout, combined with her special operations training, gave her the ability to eliminate the remaining threats before they could endanger the rescue operation. Working her way through the gardens under cover of darkness, Maria began her final hunt. The attackers were skilled and desperate, but they were also isolated and demoralized by the systematic destruction of their operation. Each engagement was a tactical problem to be solved with patience, planning, and decisive action. The first cabin contained 2 operatives who had barricaded themselves in the main room with explosive devices positioned to kill anyone who attempted entry. But Maria's approach through the building's ventilation system allowed her to bypass their defenses and eliminate both targets before they could trigger their bombs. The second cabin housed 3 attackers who had positioned themselves to ambush anyone approaching through the normal access routes. Maria's assault came from an unexpected direction, through a bathroom window they hadn't considered vulnerable, and her suppressed weapon ended the fight before they could coordinate a response. The final 2 attackers were positioned in separate cabins, but maintained radio contact to coordinate their defense. This required Maria to move quickly between targets, eliminating one before the other could react to the loss of communication. The speed and precision of her assault left no time for final desperate acts of violence. As she secured the last cabin, Maria could hear the approach of ground forces moving through the resort with professional efficiency. The distinctive sound of coordinated movement and radio communications told her that U.S. Army Special Operations personnel were conducting a methodical clearing operation of the entire property. When the soldiers reached her position, Maria was sitting on the cabin's front steps with her weapons laid aside and her hands visible. Despite her civilian clothes and apparent calm, The team leader immediately recognized the signs of someone with military training. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Rodriguez, Army Special Operations. Are you resort personnel?" "I'm Maria Santos, kitchen staff," she replied. "Former Force Recon Marine. I've secured this area and eliminated all hostile contacts in the guest cabin sector." The captain's expression shifted from police caution to military respect. "Goneri, Sergião Santos. We have your service record in our briefing materials. Outstanding work maintaining security until we could arrive." As the rescue operation continued, Maria learned the full scope of what her one-woman war had accomplished. 15 attackers eliminated, sophisticated intelligence operation disrupted, classified information protected, and innocent lives saved. The electronic equipment she had preserved contained evidence that would lead to the arrest of dozens of conspirators across multiple countries. The investigation that followed revealed connections to foreign intelligence services, organized crime syndicates, and corrupt corporations that had been operating international espionage networks for years. The attack on the Grandview Resort had been intended as the centerpiece of a larger operation to steal American technological and political secrets. But perhaps most importantly, Maria had proven that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one nobody suspects. The quiet cook who had sought peaceful isolation had become the warrior who reminded the world that evil cannot triumph when good people are willing to fight. As dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, Maria stood in her kitchen and surveyed the damage from the night's battle. Broken windows, bullet holes, and bloodstains marked the places where violence had intruded into her sanctuary. But the kitchen had served its purpose as both fortress and armory, protecting her while she protected others. The media attention that followed was intense, but brief. Maria declined interviews and refused awards, preferring to let others tell the story of how a terrorist operation had been defeated by superior planning and decisive action. She had sought anonymity in civilian life and had no intention of surrendering it for fame or recognition. 6 months later, Maria Santos returned to work at the rebuilt Grandview Resort. The new owners had enhanced security and guest screening procedures, but they had also preserved the peaceful atmosphere that made the location attractive to people seeking escape from the pressures of public life. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of respect and amazement, though they gradually returned to the comfortable routine of working with someone they knew to be far more than she appeared. The kitchen remained her domain, but now everyone understood that it was protected by someone who had proven her willingness to fight for the people under her care. The guests who stayed at the resort came from the same circles as those who had been targeted in the attack, but now they felt safe knowing that their security included not just conventional protection, but also the watchful presence of someone who had demonstrated that no enemy was too dangerous to face. Maria found peace again in the rhythm of meal preparation, the satisfaction of creating nourishment for others, and the quiet routine of life in the mountains. But she also knew that she would never again be just a cook. She was a guardian, a protector, and a reminder that those who threaten innocent people might find themselves facing far more resistance than they bargained for. The kitchen had been her sanctuary, her fortress, and her armory. But most importantly, it had been the place where a quiet woman had reminded the world that heroes come in many forms, and that underestimating someone based on their appearance or occupation can be the last mistake a person ever makes. In the end, Maria Santos had found exactly what she was looking for in her civilian life: peace, purpose, and the satisfaction of protecting others through both nourishment and, when necessary, force. The warrior and the cook had become one person, stronger than either had been alone, and ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The story of the quiet cook who faced down 15 enemies would be told for years to come, but Maria Santos would continue to focus on what mattered most to her: creating meals that brought people together, maintaining a sanctuary where others could find safety, and standing ready to protect the innocent whenever evil chose to show its face. Some battles are won with overwhelming force, others with superior strategy. But the most important victories come from the determination of individuals who refuse to let evil triumph regardless of the odds they face. In the kitchen of the Grandview Resort, one such individual had proven that point in a way that would be remembered long after the last traces of battle had been cleaned away. The cook had become a legend, but the legend had chosen to remain a cook. And in that choice lay the greatest victory of all.